Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is part 1 of What If Deku is Cursed Speech. Also check out the other videos on my channel. But I hope you guys enjoy. The 4 boys were walking through the forest, all the while a green-haired boy followed the 3. This boy is wearing a high-collared black long-sleeved shirt which covered his mouth and black shorts with red shoes. Midoriya noticed the sign saying keep away and no trespassing in the front, but he followed the other boys either way. Because Bakugo Katsuki, the one who was up front, is the only person that didn't call Izuku names nor make fun of how he looked because of his quirk. When I was 3 I had got these strange markings on the side of my mouth and on my tongue. The quirk doctor had said it was a powerful quirk, but I should not speak unless it was absolutely necessary. So with that, Izuku didn't speak, just observed, and his mother had always kept a watchful eye on him, even going as far as trying to teach him how to do sign language. But since Izuku was too young, she just gave up, for now at least. And whenever Izuku spoke, usually something bad would happen. His quirk has a bad drawback, that's why they call it cursed speech. The longer the words he speaks, the worse the drawback, but since he is barely 4, even saying one word will cause problems. So that's why I'm usually quiet around others. But now the 4 boys were walking at a nice pace with Katsuki marching in the lead. But soon he had stopped his march. The 2 other boys behind him stopped, so I did as well. Bakugo just smirked and looked at the big tree that had fell down. It acted like a makeshift bridge, and below said tree is a small lake. However, he raised his hand and started using his quirk, with the 2 boys following behind him. Izuku just stood there watching as the trio walked to the other side. About halfway through, Bakugo had slipped off the tree and was falling towards the water. Izuku stared in shock and unconsciously raised his hand up towards Bakugo. As he watched Bakugo fall down towards the water, Izuku didn't know what to do. After a second, he moved down his collar with his other hand and shouted attract. Bakugo looked to the side after hearing Izuku's voice. That was the first time he had heard him speak. But that's when an invisible force pulled him towards said boy. Bakugo screamed, "What's happening?" Then the blonde crashed into the green-haired boy who had fell down on his butt due to the impact. Bakugo got of the boy and was about to ask what did he do, but that's when he noticed Izuku coughing violently. The other 2 looked on in shock, with them taking a glance at one another. They both were thinking the same thing, is this Midoriya's quirk? Bakugo looked on in worry, not knowing why he was coughing, and then he looked at Izuku, coughed up blood. His eyes went wide and without a second thought yelled at the 2 other boys to get an adult or hero to help them. The 2 boys, one with wings on his back and the other, glanced at each other and ran back through the way they came. All the while, Katsuki helped Izuku up and started leading him back to the entrance of the forest. He glanced at the smaller boy and wondered why he hid the marks on his face. He wouldn't admit it to anyone, but he thought they looked cool. But then he looked at his hands, at the blood. So his quirk hurts him? He thought questionably, is that why he doesn't speak? Katsuki always wondered why the green-haired boy didn't talk, but now he knew why. Either way, the 2 boys made it to where the entrance was and noticed the 2 other boys, and then he looked behind them and froze. Behind the 2 boys were Mitsuki and Inko. He wearily walked towards them, and that's when Inko noticed her baby Izuku still coughing. She ran up to the 2 boys and handed Izuku a bottle of cough syrup. Said boy drank it, and after he finished, Izuku rubbed his neck and gave a grateful nod to his mother. Mitsuki walked over and stared at her son in anger. Seeing the approaching danger, Bakugo put his hands up defensively. "It wasn't my fault." Smack. Mitsuki had smacked him on the back of the head. "You know, when it says keep out, maybe you should listen, brat." "Oi, why did you do that, old hag?" Smack. The 2 glared at each other while Izuku looked on in amusement, and Inko continued to fuss over Izuku. But that's when the 2 other boys came over to them, and Bakugo looked at Inko and back at Izuku. "So that's the drawback of your quirk?" he questioned. All he got in response was a nod from Izuku. Bakugo smiled and held his fist out to Midoriya. Izuku looked confused for a moment, but brought up his own fist, and with that the 2 bumped fists, both having smiles on their faces. Time skipped to 10 years later. Throughout the years, Izuku learned how to talk through rice recipes, which usually confused mostly everyone except for Katsuki. After being Izuku's friend for so long, it was only natural that he could understand him easily now. But Izuku has trimmed his hair and now has it down. He also has a black mask over his mouth and is now standing at 5'4". Anyways, back to the story. The duo were walking towards school, and on the way to the train station there was a villain fight. Bakugo looked on at the pro heroes that were close by, then back at the main one that was fighting the villain. It was Kamui Woods. The blonde glanced at the green-haired boy at his side and spoke, "Don't you think it's weird how the other heroes aren't really doing anything besides from keeping the crowd back?" Izuku glanced at the crowd, then at the fight. "Salmon." Katsuki just shrugged and started to walk away. "Well, it's not my problem. All I know is I'm not gonna be like that when I become a hero." In response, Izuku just followed the blonde and is now walking by his side. All the while typing on his phone. Then he sent a text to Katsuki, who looked at his phone and back at Izuku. "Oh crap, we're gonna be late. Salmon." And with that, the two boys ran to Eldora Junior High. The duo made it to their classroom and they found 2 empty seats in the middle of said class. As they sat down, the teacher walked in and looked at all of the students with a smile and spoke. "You all need to think about your futures. Since you guys are third years, I have these handouts for your future plans, but I know everyone wants to be a hero, right?" As he says this, the teacher threw the papers into the air, with some students activating their quirks and being loud. Katsuki glanced at Izuku and covered his ears when he noticed Izuku pull down his mask. That's when Izuku shouted, "Quiet." After he did this, everyone in the class looked at Izuku and quieted down. Instead of being mad, the teacher just laughed and spoke out loud, looking at 2 files. "Ah, Izuku Midoriya, you applied for U.A. along with Katsuki Bakugo." The class looked on at the two in shock, with some even muttering there's only a 0.5 acceptance rate. Katsuki, hearing his name being spoken, just gave a thumbs up. Izuku just nodded. But that's when another kid spoke up, "But don't you get injured from using your quirk, Midoriya?" Izuku just glanced at him and shook his head no. Seeing this, Bakugo glanced at his classmate and spoke, "He is able to control his quirk, but he still has some drawback, but depending on how much he speaks, Izuku will be fine." Anyways, time skipped to the end of the day. Katsuki glanced at Izuku and held his fist out for the green-haired boy. And that's when the blonde spoke, "Tomorrow let's meet up to train together." Izuku just nodded and bumped his fist against Bakugo's. With that, the two walked away, going in different directions. The green-haired boy walked towards his home and pulled out his trusty cough syrup that he always has to refill. Izuku sighed and turned the corner. There he saw a big slime thing, and then that's when he noticed the girl inside of said thing. They were under a small bridge and it looked like the girl was about to go unconscious. Izuku, thinking, quickly runs towards the duo, and the slime villain noticed his approach. He growled and shouted, "Get away, brat." The slime villain then launched a few tentacles at the brat that was interrupting him, all the while the black-haired girl inside the villain looked at Izuku in surprise. She would have made her bag bigger with her quirk, but since she can't breathe, the girl can't think straight and activated. But back with the green-haired boy, he dodged the tentacles and jumped to the side, then he pulled down his mask and spoke. "Don't move." And with that, the sludge villain froze in place. Being confused, he wondered out loud, "Oi brat, what did you do to me?" Instead of responding, Izuku ran in front of the sludge villain and thrusted his hand inside of it. Izuku smiled and grabbed the girl's shirt, then moved her to the side a bit. Once that was done, Izuku pulled down his mask once again and shouted, "Blast away." Once the attack got sent towards the unsuspecting villain along with an all might that it came out of the sewer about to scream his catchphrase. Izuku was able to move the girl out of the way the second the sludge let his hold of her slip. Then there was a boom in the area which destroyed the bridge above them, and among the rubble there was sludge scattered everywhere. Izuku started to cough and he grabbed his cough syrup and drank some of it, then he glanced at the girl at his side who was staring at him in shock. He raised an eyebrow, but before the girl could speak, All Might appeared in front of the duo looking at the green-haired boy impressed. Said boy just stared back at him blankly and nodded his head all the while saying, "Salmon." Now it was All Might's turn to raise an eyebrow. He then looked around and grinned at Midoriya. "You have a strong quirk, young man." He then emptied his soda bottle and in a blink of an eye, picked up all of the scattered sludge. Only to reappear in front of the duo once again. But at this time that's when the girl spoke to Izuku. "Thank you for saving me, my name is Yui Kodai." As she said this, said girl bowed. Izuku looked at the girl and spoke, "Salmon kelp." The girl just looked at him confused. Izuku just sighed and pulled out his phone and started to type angrily and hit speaker. "You are welcome, and my name is Izuku Midoriya, and my quirk doesn't allow me to speak by normal means." Once he put his phone away, Izuku pulled down his mask and showed the duo his markings that were next to his mouth. The girl just nodded while All Might spoke. "You have a strong quirk, young man, make sure to train well, hopefully I will see you at UA." And with that the number one hero jumped away keeping the bottle in his hand. Once he left, the girl bowed to Izuku again and asked if they will be able to meet again. Izuku raised an eyebrow again and muttered, "Salmon," with a head tilt. Yui giggled a bit and asked for his phone. Once Midoriya handed her his phone, she typed something for a second then handed it back to him. But before Izuku could ask anything, the girl ran off, all the while waving her hand back at him. Izuku muttered mustard leaf and glanced at his phone. That's when he noticed there was a new contact on his phone with the name being that of the girl that just left. He just shrugged and made his way home once again. Once he was in front of his apartment, Izuku opened the door and closed it behind him. There he noticed his mother talking on the phone. Not really caring, he walked by her and she heard his footsteps, then looked over to her side. There she saw her son walking by her and he spoke, "Kelp." Then Izuku walked inside of his room. Inko spoke after him and said dinner will be done in 20 minutes. After the family ate, Izuku showered, then went to bed. Izuku was dreaming about ramen, but that's when his phone went off and made the boy jump off his bed in surprise, which made him end up on the floor face first. He cursed in his mind and looked at who was calling him. There he saw it was Bakugo. Answering him, he growled, "Caviar, caviar kelp." After hearing this, Katsuki got a tick mark and shouted into his phone, "Boy, don't give me that tone of toppings." And in the background Izuku swore he heard his Aunt Mitsuki screaming at Bakugo to shut up, brat. But that's when Katsuki spoke again, "Anyways, meet me in front of the train station in 5. And with that he hung up and left an annoyed Izuku. Muttering something incoherent, Izuku was about to get ready, but that's when he noticed a text from Yui. Opening it, she asked if they could hang out together. Izuku raised an eyebrow and responded sure. With that taken care of, he did his morning rituals and got ready, wearing a high-collared black long-sleeved shirt with black sweatpants and his red shoes. Grabbing his wallet and phone, Izuku made his way to the train station. Once he got there, Izuku noticed Bakugo's annoyed expression. When the ash blonde noticed Izuku, he stomped over to him and shouted at him angrily, "You made me wait for 15 minutes, he growled. Izuku just grinned and shook his head. Then the two made their way to the train station. Remembering he forgot to tell his mother, Izuku quickly texted her and sat down next to Katsuki. Izuku, wondering where they were going, looked over at Bakugo. "Tuna mayo." Hearing this, the blonde glanced at Izuku and smirked. "Just wait till we get there," and with that he started to look out of the window once again. Half an hour later, the two got out of the bus and Izuku looked around, giving a curious look to Bakugo, who just motioned him to follow. They are at Yamanashi Prefecture. But anyways, Izuku followed Bakugo where he called a taxi and told the man to take them to the junkyard in the city. He nodded and the two went inside the taxi. Izuku glanced around. He never been here before, so it was a new experience. And this went on for 5 minutes, then they both paid the man and he drove off. Now being in front of the junkyard, Izuku sent Katsuki a text. "Why are we at a junkyard? I thought you said we were going to train." The blonde looked up from his phone and spoke, "This is training." Then he walked towards the junkyard, making his way towards the small building in the center. Izuku just muttered fish flakes and followed after him. Shortly after, the blonde made it to the small building and knocked a couple of times on the front door. Their old man opened the door and greeted the duo. He then looked over at Katsuki. "Ah, so are you the one who offered to clear out some of this mess?" Katsuki nodded and pulled Izuku closer. "Yeah, we will be glad to help, right, Izuku?" Izuku looked over at Katsuki confused, then Bakugo hit him on the ribs. In which the green-haired boy nodded in affirmative. The man chuckled and showed them around. As they were walking around, the man spoke, while Katsuki listened. Izuku was just looking around behind the duo, wondering what they were gonna do here, but taking a guess, this is where Katsuki chose to train. He sighed and listened in onto the conversation. The man was pointing at places where he didn't want anything and at other places to not move nor destroy. From what Izuku heard, the machine he used to destroy the cars and stuff broke. Once the man finished talking, he left back towards the small building. While Bakugo walked over to Izuku, once he was in front of the green-haired boy, he spoke up. "I know you have questions, but long story short, that man needed help, so he posted that he wanted to move and destroy some stuff in his junkyard. I had saw it last week on the internet and contacted him and told the man that we will do it for free if he allows us to train our quirks here." He said this with a big grin. Izuku just stared at him and then looked at the trash around them. He just nodded and Katsuki smirked. "Alright, let's clear out an area so we can spar." As he said this, Bakugo turned around and walked over to a pile of cars. And without a second thought launched an explosion at said cars, which luckily they had nothing inside of it, or else the explosion would have been big. But once the smoke cleared the cars that were once there was now nothing but smaller scraps, Izuku walked up next to Bakugo and the two cleared the area of small parts. When they were finished, there was now a small clearing in between the other broken cars. The two were now standing in front of one another doing some light stretches. Katsuki looked around the small clearing and spoke, catching Izuku's attention. "You think this is good enough for a spar?" "Salmon." Alright, then he got into a stance, and so did Izuku. The two waited a minute analyzing each other. Then without a second thought, the two rushed at one another. Bakugo launched a left hook towards Izuku's face, who promptly dodged and sent an uppercut towards the blonde. Said boy moved his right arm up and blocked the uppercut and tried to leg sweep the green-haired boy. Izuku, seeing this, jumps over the leg sweep and goes for a roundhouse kick to Katsuki's face. Bakugo caught the leg with both of his arms and threw Izuku over his shoulder, sending him into the side of a car. Izuku tried to catch himself, but he crashed into the car and got up grunting. Rubbing his side where he crashed into the car, he then looked over at Bakugo and lowered his collar. Not a moment later, he shouted, "Don't move." When the blonde couldn't move anymore, that's when Izuku rushed towards him, all the while Bakugo shouted, "When did I say we can use quirks, ya idiot?" All he got in response was a fist to his face. Getting annoyed, Katsuki started to launch explosions from his hands, trying to get free, and after some effort was able to fly up into the air. Izuku, looking up, shouted once again, "Fall down. Now that's just cheating." He then tried to gain balance with a few explosions, and before he reached the ground, Bakugo sent off an explosion which propelled him forward towards Izuku, who was coughing a bit, but he soon stopped once he noticed Bakugo. He tried to jump away, but Bakugo was on him in a second, sending a downward kick towards Midoriya. Izuku, seeing this, tried to block but wasn't fast enough and got hit on the side of his shoulder, which made him fall towards the ground. But before he reached the ground, Bakugo launched another explosion point blank at Izuku's face, who shouted "scatter" once he saw the explosion, which ended up dispersing the explosion to either side of him, leaving him unharmed. Izuku stood up and shouted, "Caviar, caviar, tuna," all the while pointing at the burning cars behind him. Katsuki got a tick mark and shouted back, "Oh, why, you're the one who started using it first." Izuku just looked away, muttering "salmon." Bakugo just smirked, but then a soda can hit him on the head. Now being angry, he looks at Izuku, who is just looking at him with an outstretched hand. "Alright, that's it." As he says this, Bakugo's hands light up and he rushed towards Izuku. About 30 minutes later, the two boys were now standing in front of a now destroyed junkyard. Funnily enough, the only thing that was untouched was the small building in the center. The man was yelling at Katsuki for setting off all those explosions. Then said boy would yell back, "I wasn't the one who directed them towards the cars, I was aiming at this one here." As he says this, Katsuki points at Izuku, who was whistling besides him. The man just growled, but sighed, well, at least I will be able to get new stuff, but thanks, I don't need any help anymore. Katsuki just nodded and the two boys walked away. Once the two were down the block, they both looked at each other and started to laugh, but that's when Katsuki spoke up. Well, now we are going to need another place to train. Since I found this one, you have to find the other, he said. Salmon. By the way, both of their clothes were ripped and had burn marks all over, along with scratch marks on the side of their faces, due to some debris hitting them and scratching them. So the two walked to the train station with Katsuki looking around, but as they were walking in an alleyway, they heard a man scream, and the sound of something hitting flesh. Bakugo looked over at Izuku, who nodded, and both of them dashed into the alleyway, wondering what the hell is happening. Once the two were deeper in the alleyway, they heard that noise again, but with a girl laughing. They kept running and saw that the alley they were in goes off into 4 different directions. Bakugo looked around and it smelled a lot like iron. They soon heard a cry of pain and followed the voice. After a minute, the two turned a corner and saw a blonde-haired girl holding a knife over another figure. They both were wearing the same school uniforms. Without another word, Izuku pulled down his collar and shouted, "Blast away!" The girl, hearing this, turned around and was about to shout when an airwave hit her point blank and launched her away from the guy on the ground. Bakugo ran up to the guy and noticed he was bleeding profusely. He shouted at Izuku to keep her busy for a bit. "I'm going to call an ambulance." Hearing this, Izuku took a step forward and got into a battle-ready stance, all the while keeping his collar down with his hand. Meanwhile, the girl got up and gave the two a death glare. You know, butting in on people's business isn't cute. As she said this, the blonde gave the green-haired boy a cold stare. In response, said boy responded, "Salmon," with a head tilt. Being confused, the girl was about to ask why did he say that, but that's when she dodged an explosion from Bakugo, all the while launching a knife towards the two boys, who both jumped out of the way. Bakugo glanced at his green-haired friend and spoke in a whisper. The guy was bleeding pretty bad, but the heroes and ambulance will be here shortly. We just have to hold her here. Izuku nodded and glanced at where the girl was. Both of them noticed she wasn't there anymore, but they didn't hear her move away. That's when the Izuku heard something from above and shouted, "Redirect." And with that, the multiple knives that the girl sent towards them got redirected towards the walls. However, instead of getting mad, she just smiled at Midoriya once she landed and pointed her knife at him. Izuku was now coughing, even some blood had came out. That's when the girl spoke up to the duo. You know, it looks cute when you are bleeding. Izuku and Katsuki stared at her confused. But before Bakugo could say anything, they heard sirens. The girl pouted a bit and turned around. You two were fun to play with. She then tried to run away, but an explosion stopped her. The blonde jumped away from another explosion and tried to launch a knife at Bakugo, but that's when Izuku shouted once again, "Don't move," but his voice sounded a little hoarse. The girl stared at Izuku and tried to move, but couldn't. That's when Bakugo rushed towards her, explosion in hand, but before he reached her, Izuku lost control of her and she was able to jump away, all the while throwing a knife at his arm, which made the boy wince in pain, but nonetheless he used his other arm to send an explosion at her. She got sent flying towards a wall and crashed into it. Katsuki huffed and glanced back towards Izuku, who was now drinking the rest of his cough syrup while rubbing his throat. Then the two looked forward once again and they saw the blonde girl looking down at them with a big grin. Some of her clothes were ripped and she had a few scratches on her face. She then spoke, "Well, let's meet again soon." And with that she dashed away. They both sighed and Katsuki grabbed the knife that had pierced him on his arm. Then Izuku made his way towards the end of the alleyway where Bakugo left the injured kid. And after a moment Katsuki followed after wrapping his arm with his sleeve. Both of them waited a minute, then the ambulances had arrived. And with them a pro hero came along. Both of them couldn't recognize the older hero. So the hero walked towards them along with a police officer who had just arrived. But that is the end of this part. If you enjoyed this fan fiction, let me know. I wanted to write this one for a while now. Let me know what you guys think of it in the comments and subscribe for a cookie.